مساء الخير جميعا. And I'm Hisham Al-Ghannam, a Senior Research Fellow here at the Center, and I would like to welcome you all to King Faisal Center. I also would like to encourage you all to check our social media accounts for updates on our ongoing and exciting events and schedule. We're pleased to have Dr. Paul Musgrave today with us. This is a very brief introduction about Dr. Musgrave, and it's really brief. Dr. Musgrave is an assistant professor of political science at UMass. He received his PhD from Georgetown University in 2015, published in very important journals such as International Organization and Security Studies, and also in Slate and the Washington Post. Next year, he will be an American Political Science Association Fellow working for a member of the US Congress. I urge you all to look at Dr. Musgrave publications. Dr. Musgrave will speak today about the foreign policy of the divided states of America, a very important and timely topic. Later on, we will have plenty of time to take questions from the audience, and I kindly remind you all to put all your mobile phones on silent. Without further delay, I will now turn this to our distinguished guest. The floor is all yours, Professor. If you wish, you could speak there or here.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you for that wonderful and brief introduction. I am Paul Musgrave, and I'm very proud to be here. This is my first trip to the kingdom, and I've had a really wonderful time. I'd like to thank the King Faisal Center for inviting me. I'd like to especially thank Dr. Abdullah for having me here, and I look forward to our time together. And by the way, in the Q&A session, you can ask me anything. And if I know the answer, I will tell you the truth. And if I don't know the answer, I promise not to lie, even though it is April Fool's Day. So let's get down to business. I love this photograph because it really encapsulates American politics at the moment. You have Donald Trump looking very much like Donald Trump, and to one side you have the Vice President Mike Pence looking on like an adoring spouse, and then you have the Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who does not look thrilled to be there. This talk is called The Foreign Policy of the Divided States, and someone this afternoon asked me if I was going to talk about the possibility of Texas or California leaving the United States, and we're not at that point yet. Instead, the division that we're going to talk about today is about the two political parties. And I'll say at the outset that this is not going to be a talk specifically about Saudi-American relations. There are many people, including many people in this room, who know more about the details about what has happened and what is happening right now in that relationship than I do. But this is going to be a talk about what's changing in the United States, and how what is changing in the United States is going to affect not only Washington's relations with Riyadh, but also Washington's relations with the entire world. And that's going to introduce new elements that even people who are deeply familiar with the history of the Saudi-American relationship may not expect. So let me introduce my claim, and it's very simple. It's the idea that polarization in U.S. domestic politics is going to produce greater volatility in American foreign policy. And we'll talk more about what polarization is in a minute, but for now, just accept that it's a kind of division between people in the United States over their politics. And that division is at its highest level in at least 125 years. Indeed, never in the post-1932 history of Saudi Arabia has America been so divided at home. And that profound difference is going to change how America makes its foreign policy. In particular, this leaves us with three big points. First, polarization means that as the two political parties, Republicans and Democrats, alternate in office, they are going to pursue starkly different foreign policies. Second, this means that a lot of routine processes of American government are going to become harder and harder to carry out. We've all seen just recently the American government literally shut down. But that's not the only implication of a more polarized America. And those implications for foreign policy are going to be equally profound. And finally, I am an American, as you've probably guessed. And I mostly write for and teach Americans. But today I'm talking to an audience full of people who have to live with America. And for you, I want to talk about the opportunities and dangers that this newly polarized America presents for its partners, allies, and rivals around the world. So let's see where we're going to go. First, I'm going to introduce you to what polarization is and how significant it is right now. Second, I'm going to talk about why polarization, which is a domestic factor, is going to change American foreign policy so dramatically. And then we're going to look at both historically and in the future how polarization is going to increasingly change America's relations with the rest of the world. So not only am I an American, I'm also a professor, and professors love to be very specific. So just so we all know what I'm talking about when I say polarization, here's a very basic definition. Imagine something that is very smoothly distributed along a continuum, and then suddenly it collapses into two polar opposites, just like a magnet. And now there's nothing in the middle. That's the basic idea of polarization. And when we talk about political polarization in a two-party system like the United States, we're talking about the same sort of idea but just applied to politics, where that thing that had been smooth and continuous, where the political opinions and the political policies and the ideas and even the friendships and relationships among politicians, but they're now being snapped back into those two polar opposites, into boxes labeled Democrat and Republican. So political polarization is this process of emptying out the middle, of reducing the space for compromise. So how do we know that political polarization is taking place in the United States? Well, if you haven't picked up on it from the headlines and from the way that American politics has become much more savage recently, we can turn to data. And as a political scientist, there's nothing I love more than data. Last year, Georgetown University polled a representative national sample of Americans, and they asked not how members of one political party felt about members of another party, but whether Democrats viewed Republicans as a threat to the United States. A threat. Whether Democrats saw Republicans as a threat, Republicans saw Democrats as a threat, and the numbers were shocking. In fact, huge numbers of Americans said that they saw members of the other party as an actual threat to the United States. And if we collapse those first two categories that are very serious threats or somewhat serious threats, and we just take them all together, the picture becomes even clearer. 5 times as many Democrats see Republicans as a threat to the United States as do not see them as a threat. 4 times as many Republicans see Democrats as a threat to the United States as do not see them as a threat. We find similar ideas when we look at other polls. One that I really like was also done by Georgetown University. And they asked Americans, how much confidence do you have in key institutions in American society and governance? And I just picked a few that I thought were particularly representative: the military, the FBI, Amazon. And Georgetown asked, how much trust do you place in them? And the highest value over there is 4, the lowest that anybody actually said is 2, and the variations were impressive. This first gray line is all Americans. And you can see that Americans really love the military and Amazon and really hate the president and Congress. The second line is Democrats. And then this third line, this red line, that's Republicans. And you see wide variation in how Democrats and Republicans view these core institutions of the United States. Democrats trust Amazon, FBI, and the courts, and they don't trust the presidency or Congress. Republicans trust the military, the presidency, and Congress. And this is not a long-held principle. Instead, this is simply reflecting the fact that Republicans, when this poll was taken, controlled both Congress and the presidency. What this data tell us is that Americans only trust institutions to the degree that they think that those institutions work for them. And that's evidence that that middle ground is falling away. We find evidence also of this when we turn to foreign policy and we look at different issues. Americans were asked if they thought given issues were top priorities or not top priorities for the United States. And again, I pulled out a representative sample of those issues, from protecting jobs of American workers all the way down to dealing with global warming. This first line is Democrats. This second, bottom red line, is Republicans. And you can see that there are some things that Republicans and Democrats agree on, like fighting terrorism or protecting jobs. But when it comes to aiding refugees, Democrats see that as a top priority and Republicans don't care. When it comes to restricting immigration, both illegal and legal, Republicans want to do that and Democrats don't. When it comes to global warming, Democrats see that as almost the top priority for the United States, and Republicans are opposed. If we take the difference between the two parties and we look at all of the issues that they were surveyed on, an even starker pattern begins to emerge. So they were asked about a whole lot of issues, and here we're just subtracting the percentage of Republicans from the percentage of Democrats who viewed each issue as important. And what we see here is those red lines, which are Republicans, they tend to focus on issues that are very nationalistic and very militaristic, like limiting the power and influence of Iran, popular maybe in this room. Whereas Democrats tended to favor more multilateral initiatives, like taking care of existing alliances, maybe also important to people in this room. This is a portrait of an America that is divided. Ironically, and this is totally coincidental, I did not know this would be the case, the only issue that Republicans and Democrats did not disagree on is right in the middle, which is solving the Israeli-Palestinian problem. That is the only issue that Republicans and Democrats view as equally important to the United States. So perhaps Jared Kushner will find bipartisan support after all. So we have here a portrait of two groups that are really just locked in battle. But I think it's a fair question to ask whether this is just things that we're picking up on survey opinion data, or whether this really matters for how policy is made. And I think that it really does matter. But first, I'm going to give you two responsible and reasonable arguments about why polarization might not matter. And the first is that maybe, foreign policy is just made by states in their national interest. That there's one single set of objectives that everybody in a government, that everybody in a society really wants to have realized. And so domestic politics, polarization, no polarization, it doesn't matter. Those interests are unchanging, and so states will pursue them. The second answer is different from that one, and that holds that states make their foreign policy based on compromises among all the different groups in society, corporations, religious groups, civil society, individuals, and they all have a little piece of power, and they use that to try to force policy to where they want it to be, and the compromises that result from that struggle give you a foreign policy. Both of those would say that polarization doesn't matter because the national interest is still there, because those forces in society are still there, but I think that both of those answers are wrong. Or if not wrong, at least incomplete. Because neither of those theories can explain big changes in how U.S. foreign policy is made. Neither of those theories explains why it is that U.S. foreign policy toward Iran changed so dramatically between 2015 and 2017. Neither of those theories explain why the United States went from trying to negotiate trade agreements to trying to tear them up. And neither of those theories explain why we're all glued to President Trump's Twitter feed trying to find out what American foreign policy toward Qatar or the Golan Heights is. There's something else going on in American foreign policy that isn't captured by those two old explanations. And my proposal, which I'm writing as a book and which is forthcoming in the security studies article that you mentioned, is that we have to take political parties seriously in foreign policies. And we have to do that because governments are not just servants of interest groups. Governments are not just beholden to some abstract idea of the national interest. As you know very well, governments have the ability to be imaginative and to set their own agenda. Sometimes governments can use that to pursue a broad-based public interest, or sometimes they can make mistakes. And sometimes there's even bad governments. But governments are independent to at least some degree of their societies. And that means that changes to how governments are chosen can lead to profound differences in the policies that governments make. When we talk about the American case, when we talk about how governments are chosen, the single most important thing to recognize is that the government is dominated by elected and appointed members of the two political parties. There are some American institutions that are largely non-political. The military, most of the intelligence services, and of course, the Foreign Service. But when you look at even the senior policy-making positions in the State Department, in the Defense Department, the head of the CIA, these are officials who are filled from the ranks, from the networks of parties. So the president is elected, members of Congress is elected, they appoint members who share their political beliefs, and that means that we're dealing with a government that is chosen by two political parties that are increasingly separate from each other. So why is it that parties matter? I mean, you could imagine a world in which parties don't matter, in which this is all just like watching a sports team. One team wins, one team loses. It doesn't matter because they're going to do the same thing. But that's not how American politics works right now. First of all, each political party reflects the different preferences of the people who have chosen to join and donate to and vote for those political parties. Second, in today's America, once you join a political party, you have access to different information. You watch different news channels. You read different newspapers. You follow different accounts on Twitter. So you're dealing with a different portrait of the world. And finally, the interest groups who line up behind each political party are very different. ExxonMobil is not really thrilled when a Democratic president wins. Environmental groups are not really thrilled when a Republican president wins. And when you take these different preferences and interests and information together, what you end up with is a point that is just fundamental. Different parties are going to produce different policies, and there's no reason why foreign policy should be exempt from that. Different parties will give you different foreign policies. There are three different parts of any given party. The first is what political scientists call the party as organization. Those are the professional people who manage the political parties. Those of you who know about the Republican National Committee or the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, these are the people who fundraise and manage and organize. Then there's the people whom we identify with parties, people like President Trump or Speaker Pelosi, the elected and appointed officials who are in government and actually execute the policies that are demanded by the largest group, the party in the electorate. So if you think about those as voters, the party in government as candidates and office holders, and the party as organization as those official party committees, you have three distinct groups, and they're not all homogeneous. They have different interest groups within them, but they're also not identical with each other. They all have different relationships and different interests, and the balance of power between them changes over time. In the 2016 Republican presidential campaign, for instance, that primary before the general election, it was obvious that the party as organization, the Republican Party organization, and the Republican office holders did not want Donald Trump to win. He was the last candidate that they wanted. Literally, one of my colleagues has found polling data on that. The only people who wanted Donald Trump to be president were Republican voters. And they won that fight. And because they won that fight, they got a very different set of policies being enacted in many regards than they would have otherwise. So there are internal fights within each party. But the big thing about any political party is that every member of those groups is ultimately working for the same goal, which is to take power. Any political party, be it the Republican Party in the United States or the Chinese Communist Party, wants to seize and maintain power. But since we're not talking about single-party states, we're talking about a country that has elections, the big thing is the competition between the two parties. The Democrats have similar internal dynamics as the Republicans, but when it comes to election day, people want to either vote for the Democrat or vote for the Republican. Those are basically their only options. And here's where things start to get really interesting, because polarization changes political parties. When you have that smooth continuum where things are not polarized, then interest groups can make deals with one or both parties. They can even switch parties from election to election or issue to issue. But as polarization becomes more intense, there's much more pressure for an interest group or for individual voters to stay with one party forever. That middle starts to disappear. That also means that you have fewer institutions and even individual people who can broker agreements between the two parties, because people are not trusted if they're trying to work both sides. And that means that compromise between the two parties becomes less and less possible. The only way for a party to take power and to get its issues, to get its policies enacted, is to actually win elections. And that's a different story to how American politics worked for a large part of the 20th century. What this means is that the policy that the government sets is going to be much more extreme, because now there's not going to be as much negotiation. Everything is going to come down to a contest for power. It means that the most important fights over policy are happening within each party. If you pay really close attention to American politics, you've either already figured this out or you at least have a glimmer. But this is why keeping track of how different interest groups within the Republican or within the Democratic coalition, whether they have the upper hand, is really important to knowing how the government will behave. Policy isn't set in the middle between the two parties, but in the fights within each party. And a key point is that leaders of each party who fail to deliver what their base wants, what their coalition wants, can be replaced. Many of you have heard of the Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She came to power not just in a primary election, but she defeated one of the most powerful House Democrats because, in her district, that powerful leader was not giving his district what they wanted. And that has changed how Democratic politics operates. So we're talking about a very different model of democracy than one that only operates at the ballot box or one that's defined by compromise. Even if you think that elections will force the two parties to come back into the middle, I have some bad news for you. This is one of the most important charts in American political science. It shows, on the y-axis, the incumbent vote share in every presidential election going back to the 1940s. And on the x-axis, it shows economic growth. The implications of this model are really stark. The most important single factor in determining who wins the American presidency isn't each party's policies. It is how well the economy is doing when the election is held. If the economy is doing poorly, the incumbent party is going to lose. If the economy is doing well, the incumbent party is going to win. And if the economy is doing so-so, then elections become much closer to a coin toss between two parties. I want to repeat this because it is absolutely critical. You can explain who wins the presidency if you know how well the American economy is doing, not where the two parties stand. And this gives political parties a huge ability to set policy where their base wants it to be, not where the people want it to be. That's why those fights within each party is so important, because when you go into election season, how well GDP is doing is much more important than each party's platform or policy documents. Now, some of you may be saying at this point, wait a second, foreign policy has long been an outpost of bipartisanship, and certainly during the Cold War, U.S. foreign policy was largely bipartisan. And if you know the history of individual American alliances, you might also be saying, wait a second, important U.S. alliances have long been conducted on a bilateral basis, with each party over decades supporting those alliances. But that's not how it works now. Instead, we're going to turn to a little bit more data. This chart is more complicated, so bear with me for a second. Political scientists in the United States have devised a way to take every vote ever cast by every member of Congress on every issue, going all the way back to the beginning of the Republic. This only goes back to the 1850s, 160 years ago. And they use that to determine whether each legislator is more conservative, so more to the right, President Bush, President Trump, or more liberal, President Obama, President Carter. And what this chart tells me is that way back here on the left-hand side of the chart, at the beginning, there was a big gap between the two parties. And then that gap disappeared. The two parties were much closer to each other. And more recently, that gap has widened again. Well, I just said that foreign policy during the Cold War was bipartisan. But here's the thing. All of American politics during the Cold War was bipartisan. The Cold War almost exactly overlaps with a period in American politics where the two parties voted often in overlapping coalitions. What's interesting to me being in Riyadh and talking about this is that that period also exactly overlaps with the history of the U.S.-Saudi relationship up through the Persian Gulf War, the 1991 war. But as you can see, that condition doesn't hold anymore. We're in a very different set of polarization. And if we want to understand what's happening now, we can't look back to the Cold War. We instead have to look back to the 19th century, the last time that U.S. politics were this divided. So what was U.S. foreign policy like during this period? Well, a large part of my book deals with going into the very fine details of how policy was made in the 19th century to understand this, but here's the bullet points, literally. In the 1840s, the United States fought a war with Mexico, took half of Mexico's territory. That's Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, California. But this, even though it took a huge part of Mexico's territory, was a very unpopular war, and it was balanced between the two parties. The Democrats of the 1840s were the more warlike, more bellicose party, and they wanted that to happen. But if one election had gone differently, 5,000 votes had been cast differently, the United States would not have fought that war. In the 1860s and 1870s, the United States considered taking a number of Caribbean ports, of Caribbean islands. They even thought, not in the Caribbean, about buying Greenland from Denmark. But all of those fell apart because Republicans didn't want a Democratic administration to get credit for foreign policy triumphs. So even if it had been in the public good, they said, we're not going to do that. In 1898, another relatively unpopular war came as a surprise. A Republican president and a Republican Congress used an incident with Spain to go to war with Spain and steal most of its empire: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. Almost overnight, setting aside 100 years of tradition that the United States would not have an overseas empire. Vanished in a second because of one political party's project. And then between 1918 and 1922, political divisions between Republicans and Democrats made it impossible to have a League of Nations. This is a record of extreme foreign policy volatility. This is what happened the last time the United States had such structurally divided politics. This is not arguing over one clause in a treaty or another clause of a treaty. These are huge make or break decisions for a country, and they hinged on a knife's edge. Those are the kinds of conditions that we're entering. So what does this mean for America's allies, partners, and I'll let you decide which category President Putin fits in. I think that the implications are pretty big. The first is that U.S. foreign policy is going to differ dramatically depending on which party wins the White House and whether they win both the White House and each House of Congress. We've already seen that to an extent. I really like this polling data because it dramatically illustrates the similarities and the differences between Republicans and Democrats. These are the top 5 foreign policy issues that voters in each side mentioned. And you can see that there is a lot of overlap on issues like terrorism, on issues like preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. But literally 40% of the top issues for both parties are different. A Democratic administration responsive to what its base wants is going to prioritize climate change and multilateral agreements. A Republican administration is going to do what, in one case, President Trump is doing with regards to illegal immigration, and in another case is what he says he's doing with regards to making sure that America is the military #1 power. These do not appear on each other party's list. These are different by party. And if we go back to that earlier poll and we look at these differences, these key differences between the party, the foreign policy that Republican voters favor is one that would be much more aggressive toward China, much more aggressive toward terrorism, much more demanding that other countries pay their share of world order. When President Trump talks about wanting NATO countries to pay more for defense, that's broadly unpopular among Americans, but it is really popular with his base. Democrats would favor going after Russia harder, reducing U.S. military commitments overseas, and of course, improving U.S. foreign policy on climate change. These are substantively different policy agendas. You're also going to see, as a result of polarization, a breakdown of ordinary government processes. I mentioned earlier that to some degree, government shutdowns, like we've seen in the United States more and more recently, have become almost routine. That's a consequence of polarization that doesn't just affect America domestically. If you had business with the State Department during that period, you know that it also was affecting how the State Department ran. But that's not even the most important implication of how American government is breaking down when it comes to running the ordinary business of government. As some of you know, it takes a 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify any treaty. No political party in decades has had a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate. So that means that a majority of either party is always sufficient to block any treaty. But if you want to withdraw from a treaty, all you have to have is one vote, the president. So what do we see? We see the United States, under this administration, consistently pulling out of negotiations, consistently pulling out of treaties. But we don't see a lot of new treaties to replace them. It's telling that even the most substantively important regional initiative of the Obama administration, not really super popular here, was one that involved not negotiations for a treaty, but negotiations over an agreement that was not going to be sent to the Senate because there was no way that that or any other treaty could ever be approved by the Senate. President Trump faces the same problem. There is no way that he will ever get 16 Democratic senators to cross over and vote for a treaty that he sends to them. That is an ordinary process of U.S. government, but more and more foreign policy is going to be run through informal channels, through executive agreements, through understandings with other countries, and those aren't going to have the same force of law, and they aren't going to have the same degree of bipartisan commitment that America's treaties served during the Cold War. What does all this mean for the rest of the world? The headline news is, when it comes to American foreign policy, increasingly expect the unexpected. Who thought that this was going to happen? Who knew that the United States president would fly to Asian cities to have a meeting with somebody who called him a dotard? Who even knew what dotard meant? Things are changing rapidly. And what that means is that there's now dangers for other countries of becoming too closely associated with one party. If you base an alliance not on a relationship with the United States, and not on maintaining relationships with both parties, but strictly on a special relationship with one party, there are real and severe dangers there. Here's some examples. When we put this from Macintosh, which when I use, into Windows, it turned out that it did a very nice thing and it translated the years automatically for me. So you guys understand these years probably better than I do. At the very beginning of the 21st century, Americans did not worry about Russia. After the invasion of Crimea, Republicans and Democrats alike began to see Russia as a threat. But after the 2016 election, Democrats became convinced that Russia was the greatest enemy of the United States. And Republicans became much more sympathetic toward Russia. That means that under the Trump administration, even though sanctions have been increased, there's been a lot less confrontation than there could be under the next Democratic administration. That's a real danger for Russia for something that, who knows, they may not even have done. Similarly, for a long time, Americans of all political parties were more sympathetic to Israel than they were with Palestine. The higher your score here, the higher American voters of each party are sympathetic to Israel over Palestine. And liberal Democrats have always been more favorable to Palestine than conservative Republicans, but still, net 15, net 20 points more favorable to Israel. But after 2013, 2014, after Prime Minister Netanyahu started really making clear that he viewed Republicans as his allies, he accepted a trip at the invitation of Republicans in Congress to go to the Capitol and criticize President Obama. More and more, he has leaned on a special relationship with the Trump administration on issues like the embassy in Jerusalem, on issues like the Golan Heights, to push his agenda. And you can see that Democratic support for Israel is slipping very rapidly. If I were giving this talk in Tel Aviv, the key question would be, what does that mean if you have a President Bernie Sanders or a President Elizabeth Warren? When we talk about these dangers of becoming too closely associated with any one party, this is what I'm talking about. Because at some point, Democrats will win again. And they will remember what's happened. You're already beginning to see this in how congressional Democrats treat the Saudi-American relationship. This is now a way for congressional Democrats to score points, not even necessarily against Saudi Arabia, although there are real issues in their critique. This is not something that is just partisan politics, but it is certainly made sweeter by the way that President Trump has played up his special relationship with Saudi Arabia. It has made this alliance a target. The most recent instance in this targeting came about 3 weeks ago when the Senate voted on a resolution to invoke the War Powers Act against U.S. cooperation with Saudi Arabia in the war on Yemen. This is a list of every senator who voted for that resolution, which is against the Saudi American operation. And I've highlighted all of the senators who were or are running for president. There is a good chance, 1 in 3, 1 in 4, that the next president of the United States is in one of those blue boxes. That is something that would have real and profound implications for relations between Washington and Riyadh if this relationship continues to be polarized. So how should allies and partners respond? Well, there are no easy answers, but there are simple ones. Probably the most important advice I have is that it's a good idea to pursue strategies of deep and subtle engagement, of reaching out beyond Washington, beyond the Beltway, beyond the West Wing of the White House, and instead talking and emphasizing the relationships at a deeper level. This is one of the ways that Canada tried to do this. They called this, literally, the donut strategy. Reaching out to state governors, reaching out to local communities, emphasizing how much Canada meant economically and culturally to the United States, and going around the Trump administration in order to gain leverage. And they had a bad relationship with the Trump administration, so they were fighting a defensive battle. But if you think about countries that have real and profound investments or ties to universities around the United States, there are many other ways that this strategy could work. The most important point, however, is that Trump is not going to be president forever. And all countries' foreign policies should be resilient to changes in the administration. That being said, if you're too closely tied to one party, you might be targeted by the other. So this brings us back to the beginning. Polarization means that there are going to be starkly opposed partisan foreign policies alternating in office. It means that there's going to be more and more friction in all countries' dealings with the United States, and more surprises. And this also brings new opportunities and dangers for other countries dealing with the United States. And all of this is caused by that root phenomenon that I started with, which is that polarization in U.S. domestic politics is generating increasingly volatile U.S. foreign policies. Thank you all for listening, and I really look forward to your questions and my answers.